The pie was cold. Frederick Finley stood on the porch of his weathered sheriff's office in the dying light of a Friday evening, staring down at the tin plate sitting square on his front step like it had always belonged there. Apple by the smell of it. Cinnamon and brown sugar drifting up through the autumn air of Redemption Creek, New Mexico, 1881. He had not placed it there. He had not asked for it. And yet here it was, for the fourth Friday running, left without a note, without a knock, without a single living soul willing to claim it. He picked it up with both hands and carried it inside, set it on the worn pine table beside his coffee cup, and stared at it the way a man stares at a thing he cannot solve. Frederick Finley was a man who made his living solving things. Stolen cattle, drunken brawls, the occasional robbery that rolled through Redemption Creek like a tumbleweed with a grudge. He was not accustomed to mysteries that arrived on a tin plate smelling of cinnamon. The first time it had appeared, 3 Fridays ago, he had assumed one of the church women had taken pity on him. He was a bachelor after all. A 32-year-old lawman with a reputation for fairness and a well-documented inability to cook anything more sophisticated than salt pork. He had eaten it without ceremony and left the tin plate on his step the following morning, washed clean, as a gesture of thanks to whoever had left it. The second Friday, another pie. Peach this time, the filling still slightly warm at the edges when he found it near dusk, which told him whoever left it had not traveled far. He had walked the length of the main street that evening, watching faces, reading body language the way he read everything, with a lawman's careful eye. Nobody had met his gaze with the particular flicker of guilt that comes from anonymous generosity. The third Friday had been a wild berry pie, dark and sweet and almost violent in its richness, and it was that pie that had knocked something loose inside him, because he had sat down at his table that third Friday evening, cut himself a slice, and felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with hunger. He had felt, for the first time in a very long while, that he was not entirely alone. And now the fourth pie sat before him, apple and brown sugar and mystery, and Frederick Finley made a decision. He was going to find out who was leaving them, not to confront them, not to stop them. He simply needed to know, the way a man in the desert needs to know which direction north lies, not because he intends to walk that way immediately, but because not knowing is its own particular kind of suffering. He cut himself a slice and ate it in the gathering dark, and it was the best thing he had tasted in years. 3 months earlier, in the blazing heat of August, Redemption Creek had welcomed a new arrival with the sort of casual indifference it reserved for people who were not bringing money or trouble. Cora Blackwell had stepped off the stagecoach from Santa Fe on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a single carpet bag, wearing a dress that had once been blue and was now the color of old sky, and looking at the town with the careful eyes of a woman who had learned not to show what she was thinking. She was 26 years old. She had dark hair that she kept pinned severely at the nape of her neck, eyes the color of good river water in winter, gray-green and deep, and a mouth that was set in a line that people tended to misread as coldness. It was not coldness. It was the expression of a woman who had been through enough that she had learned to measure her trust the way a careful prospector measures gold dust, grain by careful grain. She had come to Redemption Creek because it was the end of the line. Not literally, the stagecoach went further, on to Albuquerque. But the end of the line for Cora Blackwell, who had run as far as she could run and still needed work, and needed a place and needed, most urgently, to disappear into the ordinary rhythm of a town that did not know her name. She had taken the room above the dry goods store that was offered by Agnes Beaumont, a widow woman of 50 who ran the store with iron efficiency and a surprisingly warm heart, and she had secured herself a position in the kitchen of the Redemption Creek Hotel, which served meals to travelers and to the more prosperous of the town's permanent residents. She could cook. That was the truth that had followed Cora Blackwell across 3 territories and kept her alive through things she did not speak of to anyone. Her mother had taught her in a farmhouse kitchen in Tennessee, and that knowledge, the weight of flour in her hands, the temperature of butter, the precise moment when a custard sets, was the one inheritance nobody had ever been able to take from her. The hotel kitchen suited her. It was hot and relentless and demanded everything, and when she was cooking she could not think about Daniel Beauchamp, who had married her in Memphis in 1878 and spent the following 2 years teaching her the particular geography of his cruelty. She could not think about the night she had finally left, with nothing but what she could carry, and a terror so complete it had its own heartbeat. She could not think about the warrant he had taken out for her return, the dark, legal machinery of a husband's authority in 1881, the way the law could become a cage with a man's name on the lock. She had not told anyone in Redemption Creek about Daniel Beauchamp. She had given Agnes Beaumont her name as Cora Blackwell, which was her mother's maiden name, and she had been grateful and unsurprised when Agnes asked no further questions. Women who arrived at the ends of lines always had their reasons, and Agnes Beaumont had her own relationship with the complexity of survival. Cora had been in Redemption Creek for 6 weeks when she first encountered Frederick Finley, and the encounter had left her shaking in a way that took her 3 days to fully understand. She had been walking back from the mercantile on a Wednesday morning, carrying a sack of dried apples and a paper twist of cinnamon, when she turned the corner onto Main Street and walked directly into the path of 2 men having an argument. One of the men was Harlan Greer, who owned the livery stable and was known for a mean temper and a drinking problem of some architectural grandeur. The other was a man she had not yet met, tall and lean in the particular way of men who work outdoors, with sandy hair going slightly to gray at the temples and a star pinned to his chest. Harlan Greer had his hand around the collar of a young Mexican boy, maybe 12 years old, named Tomas, who worked at the stable sweeping stalls and fetching water. Greer was accusing Tomas of stealing, and his voice carried the particular vibration of a man who had been drinking since before the sun was fully up. He was shaking the boy with a casual savagery that made Cora's stomach turn to ice. Frederick Finley said, very quietly, "Harlan, let him go." It was the voice that stopped her. Not because it was loud. It was not loud at all. It was the voice of a man so completely certain of his authority that he did not need volume to carry it. She had known men who were certain of their authority before, men who wore that certainty like a weapon, but there was something different in this voice. There was something that sounded, underneath the steel of it, like actual fairness. Harlan Greer released the boy and directed his grievance at the sheriff instead, and Cora stood against the wall of the barber shop and watched Frederick Finley handle the situation with a patience and precision she found almost incomprehensible. He listened to Greer's accusations. He spoke to Tomas with simple directness. He discovered, through a few pointed questions and the testimony of the blacksmith across the street who had been watching the whole time, that Tomas had not stolen anything, that the missing feed money was in Greer's own coat pocket, found there when Finley politely and firmly asked Greer to check before making any more accusations. Greer had swallowed his fury and walked away. Tomas had been sent on his way with a nod and a word from the sheriff that sounded like reassurance. And Frederick Finley had turned, not looking for anything, just turning to continue his morning rounds, and for exactly 2 seconds his eyes had met Cora's across the width of the street. She had looked away first. She had walked back to the hotel kitchen and set down her bag of dried apples and stood over the work table for a full minute before she understood what was running through her body. It was not attraction, not yet, or not only that. It was something more specific and more frightening. It was recognition. She had seen a man use authority gently, use it the way it was supposed to be used, as a tool for protection rather than a weapon for control, and her entire body had responded to it as though it were news from a country she had stopped believing existed. She did not speak to him. She did not introduce herself. She was not, in the fall of 1881, a woman who could afford to attract the attention of a lawman. Because Frederick Finley, being the sheriff of Redemption Creek, would have access to telegraph lines and correspondence, and the machinery of law that could reach across territories, and find a woman whose legal husband had filed a grievance for her return. She told herself to forget him. She lasted exactly 2 weeks. The idea had come to her on a Thursday, washing up after the dinner service at the hotel. She had made 3 pies that afternoon for the hotel's guests, 2 peach and 1 apple, and there was a peach left over that Agnes had told her to take home for herself. She stood in the kitchen holding the pie in both hands, and she thought about the sheriff's office on the far end of Main Street, and she thought about a man who had spoken to a frightened child in a voice that held no cruelty in it anywhere, and she made a decision that she would spend the next several months trying to understand. She left the pie on his step before dark, when the light was low enough that she could cross the street from the shadow of one building to another without being clearly seen. She had set it down quickly, heart hammering, feeling absolutely ridiculous, and walked back to Agnes's house through the back alley. She had told herself it was gratitude, an anonymous gesture of thanks for a small act of public decency she had witnessed. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she would not do it again. The following Friday, she made a wild berry pie and left that one too. She could not have explained, even to herself, the precise logic of it. She was not a woman who acted without thought. She was not a woman who indulged sentiment. She had burned sentiment out of herself the way you burn infection out of a wound, because she had needed to be practical, she had needed to survive. But there was something about the anonymity of it that made it feel safe. She could feel grateful without being seen. She could give something without being owed. She could, in the smallest possible way, reach toward a person who had made the world seem slightly less dangerous without putting herself at risk. It was her only way of saying thank you. What she did not know, could not have known, was that Frederick Finley was watching. He had positioned himself on that 4th Friday in the window of the hotel dining room at the far end of Main Street, eating his supper with a view of the street that let him observe his own front step without being obvious about it. He had a cup of coffee and a newspaper, and he watched with the patience of a man who was very good at waiting. He saw her. He recognized her immediately, because he had a lawman's memory for faces, and because he had been aware of Cora Blackwell in the peripheral way that he was aware of everyone new who came to Redemption Creek. He had noticed her in those first weeks the way he noticed everything, practically, categorically dark-haired woman, quiet, works at the hotel kitchen, lives above Beaumont's dry goods, no trouble, no drama. He had filed her existence the way he filed most things and thought nothing more of it. But he watched her cross the street in the low Friday light, moving quickly and quietly, and he watched her set the pie on his step with both hands carefully, as though it mattered that it was placed just right, and he watched her turn and go back the way she had come, and something in the careful privacy of the gesture, the way she was giving something without expecting to be seen doing it, opened a door in his chest that he had thought was sealed shut. He did not go after her that night. He went home and ate the apple pie and thought about her for a very long time. The following Monday morning, he walked into the hotel dining room for breakfast, which was a thing he had done maybe twice in the past year, and he sat down at a table near the kitchen door and ordered eggs and coffee from the girl who waited tables, and he waited. Cora came through the kitchen door carrying a tray of biscuits for the buffet table, and she stopped when she saw him, a stoppage so small that most people would not have caught it, just the briefest hesitation in her stride. But Frederick Finley caught it. He stood up from his chair because that was the kind of man he was, and he said, "Good morning, ma'am. I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Frederick Finley, the sheriff here." Cora set the biscuits on the buffet table with complete composure and turned to face him, and he saw up close for the first time the full complexity of her expression. She was watchful, profoundly, carefully watchful in the way of someone who has learned that danger can come from any direction. "I know who you are, Sheriff," she said. Her voice was low and even. "I'm Cora Blackwell. I work the kitchen here." "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Is there something I can help you with?" He wanted to say, yes, several things, and the most immediate was that he wanted to understand what he had seen Friday evening and what it meant. But he was a man who had learned that directness, which was his natural mode, was not always the right tool for every situation. "I just wanted to introduce myself," he said. "It's my custom to know the people in my town." She nodded once, and there was something behind her eyes that he could not read, which was itself remarkable because he could usually read people quite well. She went back into the kitchen. He sat back down and drank his coffee and told himself he was a patient man. He was not, where this was concerned, a particularly patient man at all. He came back to the hotel the following Monday, and the Monday after that. Each time ordering breakfast, each time exchanging a few sentences with Cora Blackwell, each time learning something small and precise about the topography of her caution. She was never unfriendly. She was never warm. She was courteous and measured and professional, and every time he spoke to her, she gave him exactly what was required and nothing additional. He was fascinated in a way that was beginning to be inconvenient. He had been married once, briefly, in the early 1870s, to a woman named Sarah Aldgate, who had died of a fever in their second year of marriage. He had not been seriously interested in anyone since. Not because he was committed to grief, 10 years was too long for that, but because the work of keeping Redemption Creek from eating itself alive left him little time or energy for anything beyond the basic maintenance of his own existence. He slept, he worked, he maintained a thin social life that consisted largely of playing cards with the doctor and the telegraph operator on Saturday evenings, and he told himself this was sufficient. Cora Blackwell was doing something to that sufficiency. She was making it feel insufficient. The thing that broke the professional surface of their Monday morning exchanges happened on a Thursday in late October. He had been crossing the alley behind the hotel on his afternoon rounds when he heard raised voices. One was a man's, traveling salesman type passing through. He had seen him at the hotel earlier. The other was Cora's. He turned the corner to find the salesman had backed her against the wall of the alley and was being precisely the kind of man that made Frederick Finley's jaw go tight with a controlled fury that he kept carefully banked behind his professional composure. The man was not yet violent. He was what came before violent, entitled and insistent and not listening. "I suggest," said Frederick Finley, stepping into the alley with a stride that was unhurried and completely certain, "that you step back from that woman." The salesman stepped back. He looked at the badge and made some quick internal calculations and excused himself with the particular variety of hurried dignity that Frederick had seen many times before. He turned to Cora. She had pressed herself flat against the wall and her face had gone very still, the expression she wore when she was managing something internally. She was looking at him, and then she looked away, and he saw her hands, which were pressed flat against the wall at her sides, and they were shaking slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, and then she said very quietly, "Thank you." He wanted to reach out and take those shaking hands in his own. He did not. He simply nodded and said, "I'll be by the hotel most afternoons, but if you need anything you can send word to my office." And he turned and continued his rounds, because he understood with an instinct he couldn't have named that she needed him to act as though what had happened was ordinary and handled, not dramatic, and not requiring further acknowledgement. What he did not see, because he had already turned the corner, was Cora Blackwell closing her eyes against the alley wall and breathing slowly through her nose, fighting down something that was not gratitude and not relief, and not quite any single emotion she could name. But that had everything to do with the careful way he had spoken to her, and the fact that he had walked away afterward without demanding anything in return. She went home that Thursday evening and made an apple pie because it was what she knew how to do with feelings she couldn't express any other way, and she left it on his step the following Friday and tried very hard not to think about what it meant. She told herself firmly, a practical woman. She was a woman with a real and present danger attached to her name, with a legal husband somewhere in Tennessee or perhaps by now in New Mexico. She had received no word, but she was not naive enough to believe Daniel Beauchamp had simply accepted her absence. She was a woman who could not afford to attract a lawman's personal attention. She was a woman who could not afford to feel things. She lasted approximately 3 more weeks before the feelings won. It happened simply, as the important things often do. She had come in from the cold one November morning, carrying a sack of flour for the hotel kitchen, and she had pushed through the door too fast, and the sack had split, and flour had gone everywhere, across the floor and across herself, and across the startled figure of Frederick Finley, who had apparently also been pushing through the hotel's front door at exactly the same moment from the other side. They stood in the doorway in a cloud of flour and looked at each other, and then Cora Blackwell did something that surprised her completely. She laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a managed social laugh, but an actual laugh, full and sudden and slightly undignified, and once it started she could not immediately stop it. Frederick Finley, who was wearing flour on his hat and his shoulders and his badge, looked at her for one brief moment with an expression she would think about for a long time afterward, and then he laughed too. A real laugh, warm and unguarded and entirely unlike the careful professional courtesy he had shown her for weeks. They stood in the flour-dusted doorway of the Redemption Creek Hotel and laughed together, and when it subsided they were both slightly breathless and standing closer together than they had ever stood, and the distance between them felt suddenly and urgently different. "I am sorry about your hat," she said. "I've had worse things happen to my hat," he said. "Are you all right?" "I've lost a good deal of flour," she said, "which is a more serious problem." "I'll buy you more," he said immediately, and she shook her head. "You don't need to do that." "I'd like to," he said, and the way he said it made her look up at him, because it was not the offer of a man being polite. It was the offer of a man who meant it, who wanted to give her something even though she had not asked for it. She thought about pies left on front steps. She thought about the specific quality of wanting to give something to a person without asking them to receive it. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He bought the flour at the mercantile and carried it back to the hotel kitchen himself, and she let him. And while he was setting it on the work table, he looked around the kitchen with a curiosity that was genuine and not performed, and he said, "This is where you make the pies, I'd imagine." She went absolutely still. She turned from the work table and looked at him, and he was looking at her with that calm, careful gaze that she had come to understand meant he was being entirely honest. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "I think you do," he said gently, not accusing, not triumphant, just honest. The silence stretched between them, and then she said, "You saw me." "4th Friday," he said, "but I'd already guessed by the 2nd." She turned away from him and looked at the kitchen wall for a moment, and she felt something complicated moving through her chest, embarrassment and exposure and something else, something that might have been relief, because she had been carrying the secret of those Friday pies and the feelings behind them alone. "It was a way of saying thank you," she said finally, still facing the wall, "for what I saw you do, in the street, with that boy." She heard him move, and then he was beside her, not touching, just beside her, and she did not step away. "Tomas," he said. "Yes. He's a good kid," Frederick said. "Harlan Greer is a problem I'm working on." She turned to look at him, and he was close, closer than propriety entirely recommended, and she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes and the gray at his temples and the particular quality of his attention, which was something she had thought about more than she wanted to admit. "You could have just told me," he said. "No," she said. "I could not have." He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought he might ask why, and she was already building the wall she would have to erect, but he did not ask. He simply nodded slowly, as though he understood something he had not been told, and said, "Well, the pies are excellent for whatever reason they're given." She felt the corner of her mouth move despite herself. "The apple is the best," she said. "It is," he agreed. "It was." He left the kitchen, and she stood in it for a very long time, and she understood that she was in serious trouble. The November light came early and cold to Redemption Creek, and Frederick Finley walked through it on his daily rounds with a mind that was significantly less organized than usual. He was a man who prided himself on clear thinking, on the ability to separate the relevant from the irrelevant, and to focus on what was in front of him. He was finding this increasingly difficult where Cora Blackwell was concerned. He knew very little about her. He knew what she had told him, her name and her work, and the fact that she had come from Santa Fe, though he had noticed she never spoke of anything in Santa Fe with the specificity of someone who had actually lived there long. He knew the things he had observed, her caution, her control, the way she moved through Redemption Creek like a woman who was always aware of the exits, the way she flinched very slightly at raised voices, not visibly, but in a way that his trained eye caught. He was not in the habit of running telegraph inquiries on people who had given him no cause for suspicion. That was not the kind of lawman he was. But he was in the habit of noticing things, and what he noticed about Cora Blackwell was a woman who was carrying something heavy and private, and was managing it with a courage that he found quietly extraordinary. He had also noticed that she had not, since he had revealed that he knew about the pies, left any further pie on his step. The Friday after their conversation in the kitchen had come and gone with no pie, and he had been surprised by how much that absence registered. He went to the hotel for breakfast on the following Monday. She brought biscuits out from the kitchen and set them on the buffet table, and when she turned, he was already standing. "Good morning, Miss Blackwell," he said. "Good morning, Sheriff Finley," she said. "I notice," he said carefully, "that there was no pie this past Friday." She looked at him with that measured expression. "You said you knew," she said. "It would hardly be the same if it weren't anonymous." "It would still be a pie," he said. "The pie was never really about the pie," she said, and then she seemed to realize what she had said because something shifted very briefly in her face, a flash of self-consciousness before the composure reasserted itself. He sat down at his table. She started to go back to the kitchen. He said, "I'd like to ask you something." She stopped. "Would you walk with me?" He asked. "Sunday afternoon. I know there's a stretch of the creek south of town that's worth seeing this time of year before the real cold sets in." The silence was long enough that he thought she would say no. "Yes," she said. "All right." He did not let himself smile until she had gone back through the kitchen door. Sunday afternoon arrived with a sky so clear and blue it seemed almost theatrical, and Cora walked beside Frederick Finley along the south bank of Redemption Creek, with her hands folded in front of her, and her heart beating somewhat faster than the circumstances strictly required. The cottonwood trees along the bank had gone gold, and the leaves came down in slow spirals around them when the wind moved through, and the creek itself ran low and clear over flat stones, catching the afternoon light. He talked easily, which she had not entirely expected. He talked about the town, about the people in it, with an affection that was practical rather than sentimental, the way a doctor talks about patients, with care but without illusion. He talked about the work of keeping order in a place like Redemption Creek, which was not a violent town, but was not a gentle one either, a place where the railroad money had created opportunities, and the opportunities had created the full spectrum of human response. She listened and asked occasional questions, and at some point she realized that she was not managing the conversation, that she had stopped measuring her words and was simply talking to him the way she had once talked to people before. He asked about her cooking, and she told him about her mother's kitchen in Tennessee, and he asked about Tennessee, and she said that she had left there some time ago, and he said simply, "Do you ever think about going back?" "No," she said, and the word had more weight in it than she'd intended. He looked at her without prying and said, "I've never been to Tennessee." "It's beautiful," she said, "but not all beautiful things are safe." He was quiet for a moment. The creek moved beside them. A hawk circled something distant and invisible. "You're safe here," he said. It was such a simple thing to say. And yet it hit her somewhere deep and unprotected, because it was the first time in 3 years that anyone had said that to her about any place, and because it had come from him, a man with a badge and the authority to make it mean something. "You don't know what you're promising," she said very quietly. "No," he said honestly, "but I don't say things I don't mean." She looked at the creek for a long time and then said, "I appreciate that." They walked back to town as the sun went lower and the air went cold, and he walked her to the door of Agnes Beaumont's house, and she stood on the step and looked at him and thought about all the things she was not saying. "I'll leave another pie on Friday," she said. "If that's all right." "That would be very all right," he said. She went inside. She stood in the hallway of Agnes Beaumont's house and listened to his footsteps going down the front walk and thought, with great clarity and considerable fear, that she was falling in love with Frederick Finley. She was falling in love with a sheriff, the one variety of person on earth she could least afford to love. She went to the kitchen and started making a pie. Agnes Beaumont found her there an hour later, rolling out dough with the focused intensity of a woman processing large feelings through physical labor. Agnes was the sort of woman who had arrived at 50 with all her illusions gone and a remarkably clear view of what remained, and she sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands and watched Cora for a while. "You've been out with the sheriff," Agnes said. "Walking," Cora said. "Along the creek," said Agnes. "It isn't anything," Cora said. Agnes looked at the pie with the expression of a woman who had lived long enough to understand that pie made at 7 in the evening, for no obvious reason, was always something. "Cora," she said, after a while, "I haven't asked you questions because it was not my place to ask them. But I want to say something to you now, and I hope you'll hear it charitably." Cora stopped rolling and looked up. "Whatever you are running from," Agnes said, "this is a good town and Frederick Finley is a good man, and good things are sometimes worth the risk." Cora looked back down at the dough. "It isn't that simple," she said. "No," Agnes agreed. "It never is, but simple and worth it are different things." Cora did not respond. She finished the pie and put it in the oven and went to bed and lay awake for 2 hours thinking about Daniel Beauchamp, and what he was capable of, and whether Frederick Finley, with his honest voice and his careful eyes and his ability to make her feel, for the first time in years, that she was not alone, was worth the danger that loving him might bring to his door. She decided, not that night but in the week that followed, that she would have to tell him the truth. She could not let this grow, could not let the Sunday walks and the Monday breakfasts and the Friday pies build into something real without him knowing what he was walking into. It was not fair. It was not honest. And Frederick Finley was a man who valued honesty in a way she had found, to her considerable surprise, that she could not disrespect. She chose a Sunday afternoon in early December, the 4th Sunday they had walked together, the day cold enough now that she wore her heavy coat and he wore his sheepskin jacket. They had developed a route along the south bank, their route, though she had not let herself call it that until just now, and they were halfway along it when she stopped walking. "I need to tell you something," she said. He stopped. He turned to look at her. He said nothing, just waited with that patience that was beginning to feel like its own language. She told him, all of it. Memphis and Daniel Beauchamp and the 2 years of marriage, and what those 2 years had contained, and the night she had left, and the territory she had crossed, and the name she was using, and the warrant she believed existed. She told it steadily, looking at the creek, her voice level and controlled, and she did not cry because she had cried about it in private alone, and she was not going to cry about it here. When she finished talking, the silence lasted for a full minute. She looked at him finally, expecting to see the expression of a lawman calculating legal obligations, expecting the shift of a man who had just been informed that the woman he was interested in was legally bound to someone else. What she saw instead was an expression so precisely controlled that she understood he was managing something significant. When he spoke, his voice was measured the way hers had been. "He hurt you," he said. "Yes," she said. "For 2 years." "Yes." He was quiet again. He looked at the creek. A muscle in his jaw was working in a way that told her the control was costing him something. "The warrant," he said. "Do you have any reason to believe he's tracked you here?" "No," she said, "but I have no reason to believe he hasn't." He nodded slowly. "I want to look into this," he said. "If there's a warrant, I'd know about it, or I could find out. The law regarding a husband's right to compel a wife's return is—" He paused, and she could see him selecting his words carefully, "a territory where my personal judgment and the written statutes do not always agree." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, "that I am the law in Redemption Creek, and I have some discretion about how I apply it, and that discretion would never be used to return a woman to a man who hurt her." Her breath left her in something that was not quite a sob and not quite a sigh. She pressed her hand briefly to her mouth. "Cora," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the way it sounded in his voice did something significant to her composure. "You should have told me sooner." "You're a lawman," she said. "I'm a person first," he said. "A lawman second, and a lawman who doesn't understand that distinction has misunderstood his purpose entirely." She looked at him in the December cold, this tall, patient, honest man, and she thought that she had crossed 3 territories and burned through 2 years of terror and arrived at the end of a stagecoach line, and somehow found herself standing on the bank of a creek in New Mexico looking at a man who made the world feel survivable. "I'm still afraid," she said. "I know," he said. "That's the sensible response." He looked at her steadily. "But I'd like to help if you'll let me." She looked at the creek for a moment and then back at him. "Yes," she said, "all right." That week, Frederick Finley sent a careful, coded telegraph inquiry to the sheriff's department in Memphis, requesting information on any outstanding civil warrants issued in the name of Beauchamp Daniel for the return of a wife. He did this through channels that were legitimate but routed through an intermediary sheriff in Albuquerque he trusted, so that any reply would not immediately identify the location of the person of interest. What came back, 5 days later, changed things considerably. He sat in his office in the winter afternoon and read the telegraph reply twice, and then sat for a while looking out the window at Main Street. Daniel Beauchamp had indeed filed a civil warrant for the return of his wife, Cora Beauchamp, in March of 1880. That warrant had been active for approximately 1 year. It had been withdrawn in April of 1881, 7 months ago, for the reason that Daniel Beauchamp had remarried, in a legal process that Frederick recognized as a fraudulent bigamy filing in a state where such things were sometimes possible with enough money and cooperative documentation. Which meant that Cora Blackwell was, by the technical reading of the situation, no longer legally bound to Daniel Beauchamp under a warrant of return, because Beauchamp himself had legally dissolved the marriage through a back-channel process. It also meant, more significantly, that she was legally free. Free in the way a woman in 1881 could be free, which was imperfect but real. He folded the telegraph reply and walked to the hotel. She was in the kitchen, and when she saw his face she set down what she was holding and waited, the way she waited for things she expected to be hard. He told her. He watched the information travel across her face, the careful processing of it, the skepticism, the testing of whether it was real, and then something slow and enormous opening in her expression like a door that had been sealed shut for a very long time. "He remarried," she said. "He did." Which effectively voids the warrant, though his process was legally questionable. But it means you're no longer the active subject of any outstanding legal action, as far as I can determine. She sat down on the kitchen stool. She put both hands flat on the work table. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her absorb it and did not rush her. "I've been running," she said very quietly, "for almost 2 years. "I know," he said. "I could have stopped running." He came into the kitchen then, something he had not done since the day of the flower, and he crossed to the work table and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him from the kitchen stool with those gray-green eyes full of something complex and enormous. "You can stop now," he said. She stood up from the stool, and she was close, very close, and something had shifted in the air between them with the weight of what had just been said and received. He wanted to touch her face. He put his hand on the work table beside hers instead, not touching, just beside, the way he had stood beside her in this kitchen weeks ago. "Frederick," she said, and the use of his given name hit him in the same place her name had hit her, somewhere unguarded. "Yes," he said. "I've been leaving you pies," she said, "because it was the only way I knew how to say things I was afraid to say." "I know," he said. "I'm still afraid," she said, "but I think I might be less afraid than I was." "That's progress," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something that surprised them both. She put her hand over his hand on the work table, just her hand over his, a small, deliberate gesture of contact. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they stood in the hotel kitchen in the December afternoon, with the cold pressing at the windows, and held hands over a work table dusted with flour. And it was the most significant moment Frederick Finley had experienced in approximately a decade. Christmas in Redemption Creek was a practical affair, celebrated with a community supper at the town hall and a church service, and an informal gathering at the saloon for those whose theology was flexible. Frederick had always spent it quietly, with the doctor and his wife and the telegraph operator, a small dinner and some whiskey, and the particular companionable warmth of people who have chosen each other's company in the absence of family. This Christmas, he invited Cora. She came, wearing a dark green dress that must have been her best, her hair done differently, pinned with a tortoiseshell comb that caught the lamplight. And when she arrived at the doctor's house and Frederick opened the door for her, he looked at her with an expression so uncomplicated and unguarded in its appreciation that she felt warmth move across her face in a way she hadn't felt in years. She brought a pie. Of course she brought a pie. The doctor's wife, a broad laughing woman named Hannah who had the gift of making anyone in her vicinity feel immediately welcomed, took the pie from Cora with both hands and said, "Oh, we have heard about this pie," and looked at Frederick with an expression of informed amusement that he endured with a dignity he felt was admirable. Cora ate Christmas dinner at a table full of people who were kind, and she laughed, actually laughed, multiple times, and at some point in the evening she felt Frederick's shoulder touching hers and she did not move away. When he walked her home through the cold Christmas night, their breath making clouds in the dark air, he held her hand the whole way. At Agnes Beaumont's door she turned to him in the lamplight from the house window. "This was a good evening," she said. "Yes," he said. "It was." He looked at her. She looked at him. He lifted her hand, the one he was still holding, and pressed his lips to her knuckles, very briefly, with a formality that was somehow also the most intimate thing she could imagine. "Good night, Cora," he said. "Good night, Frederick," she said. She went inside and stood in the hallway and pressed her knuckled hand against her own cheek in the dark. January came in hard and cold, and February was harder. And through the winter months something grew between them with the patient, inevitable quality of something that had been growing underground long before it became visible. He came to the hotel for breakfast. She left pies on Fridays, no longer anonymous, now accompanied by the understanding that they both knew where they came from, but she left them anyway, because the gesture had become its own language between them. A weekly ritual of acknowledgement that meant more in its continuation than its original anonymity had ever meant. He invited her to supper at the doctor's on Saturdays. She invited him to sit in the hotel kitchen on Tuesday afternoons when the lunch service was finished and the dinner prep hadn't yet begun, and they talked across the work table for hours, about everything and nothing, about the town and the territory and the things they had been before they arrived here. He told her about Sarah Aldgate, simply and without melodrama, the way you talk about something that has been fully grieved. She listened and asked careful questions, and felt the particular tenderness of being trusted with something. In March, he asked her if she would consider having supper with him alone, at his place, which was the small house attached to the back of the sheriff's office, a house he had furnished with bachelor efficiency and no decorative instinct whatsoever. She said she would. Agnes Beaumont watched her leave with the expression of a woman whose patience had been entirely vindicated. She arrived at his door at 6 in the evening and he opened it, and she stepped inside and looked around the stark, functional interior with its pine table and its mismatched chairs and its one shelf of books, and she said, "You need curtains." "I've been meaning to get curtains," he said. "You've clearly been meaning to get curtains for approximately 4 years," she said, looking at the bare windows. He laughed. She smiled. The evening opened up like a well-lit room. He had made supper, salt pork and beans, which were at the absolute limit of his culinary capability, and she ate it without complaint, and they sat at the pine table and talked until the lamp burned low, and at some point he moved his chair around the table to be beside her rather than across from it, and she turned to look at him, and he put his hand against her cheek, finally, the way he had wanted to do for months. "Cora," he said. "Yes," she said, and it was not an answer to a question he had asked yet. He kissed her, she kissed him back. It was a simple kiss, gentle and unhurried, with all the months of careful, patient approach behind it, and when it ended they were both quiet for a moment in the low lamplight. "I've wanted to do that," he said, "since approximately November." "October," she said. "For me," he smiled, she smiled. He put his arm around her and she leaned against his side, and they sat together in the badly furnished, curtainless, lamplit room until it was genuinely late, not talking much, just present together, and it was the most comfortable Cora Blackwell had felt in any room in years. Spring came to Redemption Creek with green pushing up through the brown hillsides and the cottonwoods unfurling their new leaves, and by April everyone in town knew, with the complete certainty that small towns always acquire about the affairs of their residents, that the sheriff and the woman from the hotel kitchen were keeping company. This information was received with general goodwill and some enthusiastic speculation from Agnes Beaumont's neighbors, who had watched the Friday pie deliveries gradually shift from anonymous to openly acknowledged, and had drawn their own conclusions. Cora was making pies at the hotel one Thursday afternoon in April when Agnes came to find her with a specific expression on her face, the expression of a woman carrying information. "There's a man asking around town," Agnes said. "I heard it from the blacksmith, asking about a dark-haired woman who came through from Santa Fe maybe a year ago, calling himself a creditor." Everything in Cora went cold. "Description," she said very quietly. Agnes gave it. Medium height, dark-suited, thin-faced. It was not Daniel Beauchamp's description, but it was the description of a man who could be in Daniel Beauchamp's employ. She set down the rolling pin and took off her apron and went to the sheriff's office, because she was not anymore a woman who ran alone. Frederick was at his desk when she came in, and he read her face before she spoke. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened without interruption, his expression going through several things quickly and arriving at a controlled steadiness that she recognized as his professional mode, the mode that meant he was moving into action. "Stay here," he said, "in this office. Lock the door after me. Frederick, he's on Main Street right now from what Agnes heard. I want to talk to him before he finds you." He paused at the door and looked back at her. "I know what I'm doing, Cora." She knew he did. That did not make it easier to watch him go. She sat in the sheriff's office with the door locked and her hands folded in her lap and thought about Daniel Beauchamp, about what his recovery of her would look like, about what a man hired to find her would do if he found her without Frederick there. She thought about the warrant being dissolved, the remarriage, the technical freedom she had. She thought about how much weight that technical freedom might carry against a determined, wealthy man who believed what was his was his. Frederick found the man outside the saloon. His name was Webb, he established quickly, a private investigator of the type that had multiplied in the territories with the growth of the railroad money, available to any client willing to pay. Webb had the manner of a man who collected information professionally and sold it to whoever hired him, and Frederick recognized the type without particular warmth. He had a conversation with Webb that was, on Frederick's side, perfectly pleasant and entirely unambiguous. He explained that Redemption Creek was his town, and that he had a thorough knowledge of its residents, and that there was no dark-haired woman, meeting the described specifications who had arrived from Santa Fe within the relevant time frame. He delivered this information with the calm authority of a man who has a badge and is not afraid to use it, and he watched Webb calculate the cost-benefit of pushing back against local law enforcement and arrive at the correct conclusion. Webb left on the afternoon stage. Frederick came back to his office and knocked and identified himself, and Cora unlocked the door and he came in and sat on the edge of his desk and looked at her. "He's gone," he said. "On the afternoon stage, but Cora, we need to talk about what this means." She had been doing that talking in her own head for the past half hour. "He'll send someone else," she said, "or come himself." "Possibly," he said. "Or he may decide that a woman who has essentially disappeared and who he has legally divorced himself from in his own fraudulent process is not worth the continued investment." He paused. "But I don't want to count on that." She looked at him. "What are you suggesting?" He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with that expression she had learned to read, the one that meant he was about to say something that mattered to him. "I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "that a married woman is considerably harder to reclaim than an unmarried one, even through fraudulent legal processes, because a married woman has a husband on site who has some say in what happens to her." The office was very quiet. The afternoon light came through the window and lay in a stripe across his desk. "Frederick," she said, "I know it's not how I would choose to ask," he said. "I would choose to ask in a more straightforward manner, with considerably less practical justification attached. But I want you to understand that the practical justification is not the reason I'm asking. I've wanted to ask for months. This is only making it more urgent." She looked at him for a long, still moment. "You are asking me to marry you," she said. "Yes," he said. She stood up from her chair. She crossed the office and stood in front of him, and he was sitting on the edge of his desk, which put them at approximately the same height, which was useful because she needed to see his face clearly. "I don't want you to marry me as a protective measure," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not. I'm asking you to marry me because I love you, and the protective measure is a secondary benefit of an action I intend to take regardless." The word landed in the room like something that had been present for a long time and was only now being named. "You love me," she said. "Yes," he said, completely simply. She put both hands on the sides of his face, which startled him, and she looked at him and she said, "I love you too. I have for some time." He put his hands on her waist and they stayed like that, close and still, in the afternoon light of the sheriff's office. And she thought that 3 years ago she had stood in a hallway in Memphis planning an escape from a man she feared, and something about the distance between that moment and this one was almost too large to hold. "Yes," she said. "All right." "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you, Frederick Finley." He kissed her there in the sheriff's office with the afternoon light on his desk and the sound of Redemption Creek going about its business outside the window, and it was nothing like the first careful kiss in his kitchen. This was full and certain, and arrived at after months of patience, the kiss of two people who have decided on each other deliberately and completely. They were married in June of 1882 at the small Methodist church at the corner of Main Street and Creek Road, on a morning so clear and warm that the whole day seemed to hold still and pay attention. Agnes Beaumont sat in the front pew and wept with an unself-consciousness that she would later describe as entirely appropriate to the occasion. The doctor and Hannah sat beside her. Tomas from the livery stable sat in the back row and looked uncomfortable in a shirt that was too large for him, which he had borrowed from his older brother for the occasion. Cora wore a dress that Agnes had helped her make, cream-colored cotton with small brown buttons down the front, her hair down for the first time since anyone in Redemption Creek could remember, falling past her shoulders in dark waves. She had looked at herself in Agnes's mirror that morning and had not recognized herself entirely, not because she had changed in her features, but because the expression on her face was new. She looked, she thought, like someone who had been forgiven something. She looked like someone who had arrived. Frederick stood at the front of the church in his best suit, which he had pressed himself with considerable effort, and watched her come down the aisle with the expression of a man in the presence of something he had wanted and had not been entirely certain he would be allowed to have. They said their words before the Reverend, and they meant every one. The reception was in the town hall, and there was a fiddle player from the saloon who played 3 hours without repeating himself, and Cora made 4 pies for the occasion, which were received with the particular enthusiasm of a town that had been hearing about these pies for 8 months, and which were, by universal agreement, worth all the anticipation. Frederick ate a piece of apple pie at his own wedding reception standing beside his new wife, and he looked at her and said, very quietly, "Still the best." She laughed, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in the town hall while the fiddle played, and the people of Redemption Creek celebrated around them. And it was, in the fullest possible sense, a good day. The first year of their marriage had the quality of something long established being finally allowed to be itself. They moved into Frederick's house, the small attached house with the bare windows, and Cora made curtains from blue cotton she bought at the mercantile, and hung them, and stood back and looked at them with a satisfaction that was about considerably more than curtains. She reorganized the kitchen with the focused efficiency of a woman who understood kitchens as profoundly as she understood anything, and Frederick watched her do it with the specific pleasure of a man watching someone be themselves, without apology. She left the hotel kitchen in the fall and began working from home, supplying pies and baked goods to the hotel and the saloon and several private households, which was an arrangement that suited everyone and that gave her the particular professional freedom she had not known she needed until she had it. She continued to make Frederick a pie on Fridays. Not left on the step, not anonymous, but set on the table of their kitchen, still sometimes cold by the time he came in from his rounds, and he always ate a slice immediately and told her what it was. "Apple," he would say, or peach, or wild berry, which I know because nothing that color comes from a civilized fruit. "It's blackberry," she would say. "You have had it 4 times. It surprises me every time," he would say. She would roll her eyes and he would pull her into his arms and kiss her temple, and it was a small ritual as reliable and meaningful as any ceremony, this weekly acknowledgement of where they had started and what it had grown into. In the spring of 1883, Cora told Frederick over breakfast that she was expecting their first child, delivering this information with the same composed directness she applied to everything, and he received it with a stillness that lasted approximately 3 seconds before he stood up from his chair and came around the table and gathered her in his arms with a gentleness that made her press her face against his chest and close her eyes. "All right," he said, against the top of her head. "All right." "You're pleased," she said. "Beyond what I have words for," he said. Their son was born in November of 1883, a solid, good-natured boy whom they named James William Finley, William for Cora's father, and who arrived in the world during a cold November night with the doctor in attendance and Agnes Beaumont sitting in the kitchen making tea and Frederick holding Cora's hand through the long hours with a steadfastness that she had not expected, though she should have. It was, after all, entirely characteristic. James was a dark-haired child who had his mother's eyes and his father's patient nature, and who took to the world with an equanimity that delighted them both. Frederick carried him through the town on his morning rounds from the time James was old enough to be carried, introducing him to shopkeepers and ranchers, and the full social geography of Redemption Creek, with the pride of a man who has something he very much wants to show the world. The years that followed had the texture of something built deliberately and well. Redemption Creek grew, as towns in the territory were growing, with the railroad money and the cattle trade and the slow settlement of families putting down roots in the New Mexico soil. Frederick's jurisdiction expanded slightly, took on a deputy, a young man named Garrett who was earnest and hardworking, and who ate Cora's pies with a reverence that she found touching. In 1886, a second child arrived, a girl they named Clara Rose, after Cora's mother, who came into the world already impatient, announcing herself at 3 in the morning with a decisiveness that never left her. Clara was her father's shadow in temperament if not in looks, curious and methodical, and fascinated by the machinery of how things worked, following Frederick on his rounds from the time she could walk, and asking questions at a rate that he answered with complete, unhurried seriousness, because he had never believed that children's questions deserved anything less. The matter of Daniel Beauchamp resolved itself in the way of many dark chapters in a person's past, not dramatically, but through the slow accumulation of time and distance. Frederick received word in 1884 through his law enforcement channels that Beauchamp had experienced significant financial difficulties and had relocated to Atlanta, Georgia, consumed by business problems that had nothing to do with Cora. The second wife, the one he had married in the fraudulent proceedings, had apparently left him the previous year. He was, by all accounts, a man whose own choices were providing sufficient consequence without any external help. Cora heard this news and felt something that was not satisfaction and not relief and not forgiveness either, but was something quieter and more durable than any of those. She felt the particular peace of a chapter that is genuinely over. She had not spent the years of her marriage in fear. She had built something real in the present tense that had outgrown the shadow of the past, and the past had, in its own time, receded. She told Frederick the evening he brought the news, and he told her, and they sat together at their kitchen table in the lamplight with James asleep in the next room and Clara not yet born, and she looked at her husband across the table, this honest, patient, deliberate man who had become the structure of her daily life in the best possible way. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said, and meant it completely. "I have been all right for some time." He reached across the table and took her hand. She turned hers over and held his, the way she had held it on the first occasion, over the worktable in the hotel kitchen, and the echo of that moment sat between them, warm and recognized. Tomas, who had been 12 that morning in the street when everything had started, was 19 by 1886, and working with the blacksmith now, having developed both the physical capability and the technical skill required. He came to Sunday dinners at the Finley house with the combination of ease and gratitude of a young man who knows he is genuinely welcomed, and he ate whatever Cora cooked with an appreciation that she found entirely appropriate. It was Tomas, in 1887, who brought a young woman named Lucia to one of those Sunday dinners, and the way he sat beside her and watched her talk to Cora across the dinner table told Frederick everything he needed to know about the young man's future. Frederick caught Cora's eye across the dinner table, and she saw that he had read the situation, and she looked back at him with a small, private smile that said she had read it too, and the silent communication of two people who have spent 5 years learning each other's language moved between them like a current. In 1888, Cora added a third pie-making day to her weekly work schedule, not from commercial necessity, but because the demand from the hotel had grown and she genuinely loved the work, loved the reliable alchemy of it, the way flour and butter and fruit and time produced something that could make a person feel, for the duration of a slice, that the world was hospitable. She had built a small reputation across the territory for her pies. People coming through Redemption Creek on the stage were told to stop at the hotel. The apple pie was famous. Frederick, who had eaten the apple pie more times than he could count, still told her it was the best thing he had tasted the first time he had tasted it. He had been telling her this for 7 years. He intended to keep telling her. There was one Friday in the fall of 1889 when he came home from a particularly long day, a cattle dispute that had required 6 hours of patient negotiation in the cold, and he came through the door of their house to find the children in bed, the fire built up, and a cold apple pie on the kitchen table. He sat down at the table and looked at the pie, and something moved through him that had the quality of a long, completed thought. He thought about a cold Friday evening in 1881, and a tin plate on his front step, and the mystery of anonymous generosity. He thought about a woman who had crossed 3 territories to survive and arrived in his town, and watched him from across a street and found no way to say thank you except through the medium of pastry left in the approaching dark. He thought about the distance between that moment and this one, and about how completely, how unexpectedly well, things had turned out. Cora came in from the other room, carrying her mending, and sat down across from him at the table. She looked at him looking at the pie. "Long day," she said. "Very long day," he said. He looked up at her. "Apple. Obviously apple," she said. He cut himself a slice. He ate it in the lamplight of their kitchen. It was cold, as Friday pies tended to be. "Cora," he said, she said, looking at her mending. "When you left the first pie on my step, what were you thinking?" She looked up from the mending. This was a question he had never asked precisely this way before. "I was thinking," she said after a moment, "that I had seen something good, and I wanted to acknowledge it without being seen, and that I didn't know any other way to say what I wanted to say." "What did you want to say?" he asked. She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the house they shared, with their children asleep down the hall and the fire built and the cold apple pie between them. "Thank you," she said, "for being the kind of person who treats frightened children with decency, for being the kind of person who makes it possible to believe that the world might be worth trusting again." He was quiet for a moment. "It turned into considerably more than thank you," he said. "Yes," she said, "it did." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held his. The lamp burned steadily. Outside the window Redemption Creek moved through its Friday evening, the sound of the saloon piano carrying faintly on the cold air, and the fire in their hearth did its reliable, ancient work. "I'm glad you left the pie," he said. "I'm glad you noticed," she said. They sat together in the kitchen for a long time after that, not talking much, and it was the specific quality of silence that exists only between people who have fully chosen each other, who have come through the difficult parts and arrived at something solid, the silence of people who have nowhere else they would rather be. The following Friday, as she did every Friday, Cora Blackwell made a pie. She made it in the morning, before the day's other work began, in the kitchen of the house on the edge of Redemption Creek, rolling out the dough with the same hands that had carried a tin plate across a dark street 8 years ago, and set it on a step without knocking. She made the filling from apples from the Beaumont orchard, sliced thin and tossed with cinnamon and brown sugar and a little nutmeg, the way her mother had taught her in a farmhouse kitchen in Tennessee that she could now think of without flinching. She put the pie on the table to cool and went about the day. When Frederick came in that evening, later than he'd intended, the day having required an unexpected survey of a property dispute on the south end of town, he came through the back door into the kitchen and stopped. The pie sat on the table in the lamplight, cold by now, as Friday pies tended to be, its lattice top golden and the cinnamon scent still present in the air. He looked at it for a moment. He heard Cora in the other room, reading to James and Clara from the book they were working through that week, her voice low and even, and his daughter's voice cutting in with a question, and then his son's voice making some observation that produced a sound of Cora's genuine laughter. He stood in the kitchen and listened to that sound and felt, with complete and uncomplicated certainty, that everything important in his life was within 30 feet of where he was standing. He cut himself a slice of apple pie and took it to the doorway of the room where his family was, and he leaned against the doorframe and ate it there, watching his wife read to his children in the lamplight. And when Cora looked up and saw him, she smiled in the particular way she had that she had never fully explained, warm and private and meant entirely for him. "Apple," he said. "Obviously apple," she said. James looked up from the book. "Did you eat pie before supper?" "This is a special case," Frederick said. "There is no such thing," James said, with the moral certainty of an 8-year-old. "Your father makes the rules," Cora said to James, but she was looking at Frederick with that smile. "Not in the kitchen," Frederick said. "In the kitchen your mother makes the rules." Clara reached out and took his free hand without looking up from the book. He looked down at her small fingers wrapped around his and felt something that had no adequate word in any language he knew. He stayed in the doorway until the chapter was finished and the pie was eaten and the children were in bed. And then he and Cora sat together by the fire, her mending in her hands, his week's paperwork in his, and the sound of the wind outside and the fire inside, and the specific piece of people who have found the thing they were looking for and have the wisdom to know they have found it. Years later, James Finley would tell his own children about his parents, would describe the story as he had come to understand it, about a woman who crossed 3 territories running from something and arrived at a town where a man was the kind of person she had stopped believing in. About pies left on steps on Friday evenings, anonymous and precise as prayer. About a lawman who read people with careful eyes and waited with extraordinary patience, and who never said things he did not mean. He would tell them about the way his father still said apple every Friday, and how his mother still said, obviously apple, every Friday, and how that exchange had continued for as long as both of them lived. He would tell them that love, real love, the kind that holds, sometimes starts with the smallest possible gesture, a pie on a step, a way of saying thank you to someone who has no idea you are watching. He would tell them that the person who deserves your gratitude is often the person who deserves your trust, and that trust, given carefully and received well, is the foundation of everything that actually lasts. Cora Blackwell had known this. She had known it and been afraid of it, and crossed 3 territories with it in the back of her mind like a map of a country she was not certain she was allowed to enter. And she had arrived, finally, at Redemption Creek, New Mexico, in the summer of 1881, and she had stood across a street and watched a man be good, quietly and without audience, and she had carried a pie across the evening dark and set it on a step and turned and gone back the way she came, and it had been enough to start everything. Frederick Finley had eaten that pie, and the ones that followed, and he had watched and waited with the patience that was, perhaps, his greatest gift, and he had held out his hand at exactly the right moment in exactly the right way, and she had taken it. And what they had built from that cold pie on a front step, from that anonymous Friday evening gratitude, was a life, a real one, with flour on the kitchen floor and curtains finally on the windows and children who asked too many questions, and a fire that needed building and a creek that ran low and clear over flat stones south of town, and the sound of a fiddle somewhere in the evening. It was ordinary in all the ways that matter. It was extraordinary in the way that only the things you nearly missed can be, and every Friday, without exception, there was pie. It was always cold. It was always apple. It was always the best thing he had tasted. She knew this. She made it anyway. That was the whole story, really, the whole arc of it. A woman who had been hurt into silence finding, one careful gesture at a time, her way back to speech. And a man patient enough to wait for it, generous enough to deserve it, honest enough to hold it right when it arrived. The creek ran south of Redemption Creek through all the seasons they lived there, the 2 of them, and then 3, and then 4, and the cottonwoods went gold every fall and unfurled green every spring, and the years did what years do. They accumulated into something with weight and texture, and the particular solidity of a life that has been built with intention. There were hard things, as there are always hard things. A harsh winter in 1891 that took 2 of the town's older residents and strained everything. A difficult negotiation with a land company in 1893 that tested Frederick's authority in ways that required more than patience. Clara's long illness in 1895, the fever that took weeks to break, during which Cora did not sleep properly, and Frederick came home between every round to sit beside the child's bed for 20 minutes before going back out, not because anything he could do would accelerate the healing, but because he could not bear to be far. Clara recovered. The fever broke on a Thursday, and Cora cried for the first time in the whole ordeal, standing in the kitchen with her face in her hands. And Frederick came in from his rounds and saw her and went to her immediately and held her while she cried, and said nothing, because sometimes nothing is the right word. She made an apple pie on Friday that week. He ate it in the kitchen that evening before supper and said nothing either, because they had been together long enough to understand that some things are expressed through continuation. That showing up, week after week, with the same gesture and the same care, is itself a declaration that does not require words. She knew he understood. He knew she knew. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough, and it was theirs, and it lasted. The years ran on like the creek, low and clear and continuous, and Redemption Creek grew and changed around them, and some things passed away and new things came, as they always do. Garrett the deputy eventually took a post further north. Tomas married Lucia in a ceremony that Cora organized the catering for with tremendous efficiency and personal investment. Agnes Beaumont reached 65 and retired from the dry goods store, and spent her remaining years doing exactly what she wanted, which turned out to include a great deal of Sunday dinner at the Finley table. James grew into a serious, kind young man who went to study law in Albuquerque in 1901, which made Frederick proud in a way that was purely unselfish, because his son was going toward something that mattered rather than toward anything his father had planned. Clara, who had always followed Frederick on his rounds asking questions, found her questions tending toward medicine, toward the how and why of the human body, and when a woman physician came to lecture at the town hall in 1897, Clara sat in the front row and came home with an expression Frederick recognized completely. It was the expression of a person who has seen their future and recognized it. He and Cora talked about it that evening after the children were in bed, and he said, she should go, meaning to school, meaning toward medicine, meaning wherever the shape of her life was leading. And Cora said, yes, and then she said, she gets the certainty from you, and he said, she gets the courage from you, and they looked at each other across the table, and it was one of those moments that contains the full weight of everything they had made together. Frederick Finley served as sheriff of Redemption Creek for 23 years in total, stepping back from the position in 1904 at the age of 55, when the territory was changing fast enough, and the nature of law enforcement shifting enough that he decided the work required a younger man's energy, and his own energy was better spent on other things. He remained in Redemption Creek, in the house with the blue curtains, with Cora. He was not a man who needed to be useful in the abstract. He was useful in the specific daily way of a person who tends their own life with care. He had a small garden on the south side of the house that he had always meant to plant and finally did, and he became, in his retirement, an extremely good grower of apples, which produced a response from Cora that he found immensely gratifying. Now you can make your own pie, she said, looking at the first harvest with her arms folded. The point, he said, is not the making. The point is the eating. That has always been my position. You have no idea what goes into a pie, she said. I know exactly what goes into a pie, he said. I have been eating them for 23 years. That is absolutely not the same, she said. Nevertheless, he said, putting an apple in her hand, this is an excellent apple. She looked at it. She looked at him. She bit into it. It is a good apple, she said. Thank you, he said. She laughed and went back inside and made a pie, and he sat on the porch and watched the afternoon go gold over Redemption Creek, his town, their town, and felt the particular, uncomplicated satisfaction of a man who has done the important things right. Friday came the way it always did at the end of the week, and the pie sat on the kitchen table, cold by the time he came in from the garden, and he sat down and cut himself a slice and ate it in the fading light. Apple. It was always apple on the Fridays that mattered most. He had said it thousands of times. He said it again. She said from the other room, obviously apple, the way she always did. And the house was full, and the evening was quiet, and everything that had begun with a cold pie on a front step had arrived, through patience and honesty and the slow, deliberate work of choosing each other at this, An ordinary Friday evening, a table, a lamp, the sound of a woman's voice from the other room, and the best pie he had ever tasted. He called out to her. "Cora." "Yes," she called back. "Come and sit with me." She came, bringing her reading with her, and sat down across from him the way she had sat across from him 1,000 times, and the lamplight came between them warm and steady. He pushed the pie toward her, and she took a fork from the table and cut herself a small piece, which she almost never did, and ate it with the particular focus of a cook testing her own work. "Good?" he asked. She considered. "The cinnamon is right," she said. "The apples are good this year." "My apples," he said. "Your apples," she said, and smiled at him. He reached across the table and she reached back, and their hands met in the middle. And outside the window Redemption Creek moved through its Friday evening, and the lamp burned, and the pie sat between them on the table, cold and cinnamon-scented and honest, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.